Well, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Goldberg, and for those of you who I have not met before, I'm the Executive Director of the Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship, which is located in Sears ThinkBox on our campus at Case Western Reserve University. And I'm also an associate professor at the business school at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case as well. So it is wonderful to be able to welcome my friend and mentor Larry Sears to participate in our entrepreneurship speaker series, alumni speaker series. And we were planning on doing this in person on the 6th floor of ThinkBox, which is our entrepreneurship space. And when we kicked off this series this year, one of the wonderful things about being together in ThinkBox, and for those that have not been back to campus, and Larry, when we were catching up with a few folks who were joining the call before, I know we have folks joining from all over the country here, but ThinkBox is an amazing space, which we'll talk about today. But I do look forward to all being back together at ThinkBox, because a big part of this speaker series was not only reaching folks on Zoom and via Facebook, but also colliding together and building that the contact points that we do at ThinkBox on the 6th and the 7th floor. So Larry, welcome. All of our speaker series events are moderated, and Masato is an awesome undergrad student from Cameroon who's going to be our moderator today. She's sitting in Cleveland, Ohio, because like a lot of our international students, she is not able to travel back home, but we're so fortunate to have Masato as a student at Case Western, and we're happy you're still in Cleveland. I know it's been a very tough adjustment for Masato and a lot of our students as we've had to move, as campuses closed down and we had to move to remote learning. So I'd encourage all of you that are watching to post your questions. Let us know if you have a question. You can ask it sort of live to Larry, or put it in the chat on Zoom, or put it on Facebook in the comments, and then Masato is going to be our moderator, and we'll weave it in there, and we'll be together for the next hour. So thank you, Masato, and thank you, Larry. And Masato, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. As Michael introduced, my name is Ngompe Masato Cindy Ferena. I'm a second year at Case studying chemistry, minor in social justice. And I actually work at ThinkBox as a student technician. So I've gotten very familiar with the space, and though it's unfortunate that we can't do it in person in the building itself, I still appreciate that the series is going on. Thank you so much, Larry, for agreeing to speak. And I'll begin with the first question. I just wanted to ask Larry, could you please begin by sharing with us your background and some of the milestones that led you to the path that you...
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, Doug, do we have the slides back there somewhere? How do we do?
Yes, they should be up now.
Yeah, all right, great. Yeah, and Masato, you're dropping out a little bit. If you could, I don't know, lean forward or do something, that might help. So, okay. There we are. Okay, so this goes back obviously to 1972. I graduated from Case with BS, and I hung around, and here I am in my glory when I had hair, teaching what was probably some sort of Circuit 1 course at the time. This is exactly where the Sears undergraduate laboratory is now, in fact, against the back wall. And so as I went for my master's, in fact, I went several times for my master's, I realized that $7,000 a year was a bit of a challenging salary to live on. And I had always, figured I would probably not work for someone else. It was just the way I was. And so during this period of time, I decided I was going to become a great entrepreneur. Doug, you missed my sit. There we are. Okay. So I rented this building. This is now the Murray Hill Market, down the street on Murray Hill. And I decided that this is where I was going to run a business. The rent was $100 a month, so it wasn't particularly challenging. And I decided that I had very severe limitations because I didn't have any money, and there were actually a lot of sort of business requirements I didn't have either. Basically, I didn't know how to sell things. I knew nothing about business management. I certainly didn't know anything about marketing. I didn't have any capital. So I had to find a way to sort of slide into business, keeping in mind these limitations. And to do that, I went into what is called the design and build business. The idea is that this was a B2B situation where I would look for companies that maybe they had a product and they wanted somebody to build it, or they had a product that needed a gizmo, a circuit board, a controller, something that went inside. The theory being that if you're in the selling to the public, if you're in a retail business, you have to build things in quantity to get the efficiencies of manufacturing. You have to, of course, fund all the components, all the labor. Then you have to put them on the shelf. Then you have to inventory them. Then you have to market them, and you wait for people to buy them. And then you have to have, of course, customer service and all that. If you're selling to a company and everything is custom, you're building to their order. If you're really good at it, you can buy the parts, build the stuff in quantity, and ship them all at once, and hopefully you'll get paid before you have to pay for the parts. So it's a very, very different approach to running a business when you look at cash flow. And of course, little companies always look at cash flow. So that's the way how I thought I would proceed. And so this is the inside of that building. This is our professional staff there in the lower left. And on the lower right is our OSHA-approved printed circuit board manufacturing facility. That was in the basement of the building. And what we were making was basically products that did not have to be, they were one of a kind to start with. There was a lot of instrumentation for General Electric. And that's our symbol to move the slides. And so I made all kinds of interesting things. And this is, as I said, test equipment. And frankly, the margins were very, very high because, you know, it was one of a kind. They didn't know who else to go to. At this point in time, there really wasn't that much solid state design around. When I was undergraduate, I was still taking courses in vacuum tubes. So this was one of the happiest times of my life because I basically designed these things myself. And, you know, the money was very, very good because I really had very little in the way of expenses. And, you know, I could buy parts at Army surplus stores and nobody cared because, you know, this wasn't production. This was stuff that was used, you know, in a test lab or something like that. I built some equipment for Case, in fact. So this is really where my education came from, was years of doing this type of work. And then little by little, I did get into what I would call production. These were things that were made in some quantity, little industrial controls and power supplies and that type of thing. And so during this time, again, I really didn't need financing. I could pretty much bootstrap everything. And the business grew. It became, you know, relatively prosperous. This was an example of the rare item that was very, very successful, though for a short period of time. This is the world's first computerized embroidery machine. And as was typical in the business, we built the circuit boards, the controls, the power supplies, and all that, shipped them all at once to this company, and they installed them inside their sewing machines. And we'd make 1,000 boards a year, and we would sell the boards for $1,000 a set. And it was a great business. But then it was such a good business that the Japanese came and bought it. In fact, this company is still in Cleveland. It's called Barradin now, and it's, you know, still probably one of the world's largest embroidery machine companies. But I lost his contract, and that was it. It was never coming back. So there was a lesson there. But in the meantime, the company grew, and, you know, eventually we moved out to Beechwood, and it was better than Murray Hill. And at the same time, though, things started to change. For example, as I mentioned, I didn't have control over the destiny over my business destiny. I was always making things for other people. So about this time, well, actually it's probably more mid to late 80s, I really decided I needed a proprietary product. And it also had to do with a lot of manufacturing being outsourced. And so that's when the nature of the business changed. And then it got pretty hairy. Then it got pretty interesting. So, Masato, we can move on a little bit and I'll finish the story. Maybe other things will come up.
Yeah, thank you for the brief background. I wanted to hear more as to obstacles you came across as you were founding Hexagram and progressing on. You mentioned not needing funding initially. Could you go further into what
Yeah,
obstacles?
I'm sorry. Yeah, you're dropping out a lot. I didn't catch some of that.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me better?
That's better, I think.
Okay. So I just wanted to ask you to speak more to the obstacles you faced as you were, in university and also founding Hexagram and moving on. You mentioned not needing as much funding initially, but can you speak more to that progression?
Yeah, it was probably no surprise to a lot of people starting a business that that funding was certainly a problem. As soon as I graduated from the design and build business and went into the proprietary product thing, everything changed. And frankly, it wasn't as much fun anymore. Also, I'll give you an example. We needed a custom integrated circuit for one of our proprietary products that I'll talk about. And it was designed by Motorola, and it was a year late. So you can imagine we had an order from a utility for 300,000 of these gizmos sitting there, and the key part was a year late. I mean, it was a nightmare. We were self-financing all this, and this is the type of unforeseen circumstance that can really put pressure on a business. And over the years, obviously this business was ultimately successful, but I was not successful really in getting funding, in getting financing, in getting venture financing. There were some little things here and there. So, I mean, the good news is I ended up owning, over 50% of the company. But boy, it was tough. It was really tough. At one point, my two examples, my bookkeeper came into the office and said, we have to close down. We just can't, we just can't run the company. We can't make payroll. Another time the bank came, as usual, looking for their money because we had bank loans. We didn't have equity. We had bank loans. And with some expletives, he threw the keys at the banker and told him, you take the place. And I mean, this was our banking relationship. So it was pretty hairy at times. It really was. No question about it. I should point out that this was a classic vertically integrated, A to Z company. In other words, we manufactured everything. Very different now, where there's a lot of essentially virtual companies where they don't manufacture. Someone could sit, in their apartment someplace and everything comes in from overseas. You have a lot of freelancers. We had machines that needed oil and made noise and cut metal, and we injection molded parts, and we did our own circuit boards, and it was a different era. Maybe we shouldn't have done all that, but everything was different then. You didn't have CAD, for example, computerized machinery making injection molds. So an injection mold that in those days was, say, $25,000, which is probably $100,000 now. Now you could have them made overseas for $10,000 and instead of $100,000. Everything has changed, and I have to sort of set the stage in saying a lot of my experience, a lot of my examples really may not pertain to the way business is done now. I think another example is now the businesses, at least the ones you read about, are financed, orders of magnitude, greater, with orders of magnitude greater amount of dollars than you were talking about, say, in the 70s. Everybody talks about the unicorns, and everybody goes out there for $1 million here, $2 million there. It's very, very different. I wonder, frankly, if people are losing something now. They're losing you know, the need to husband their resources. They're don't have to be as resourceful and as clever as they used to be. It's just a little bit different. You know, do they learn cost control the way I had to? I don't know. I knew everything there was to know about manufacturing a part because I didn't job it out. So again, times were different, but there's probably a lot of lessons there, I would say, looking at the way people used to do things.
You just spoke of time and the way that the historical context you were in kind of forced you to conduct your business in a certain way. Could you delve further into your context and cultural shift that impacted your career decisions, you know, from university and onwards?
Okay, yeah, again, I didn't hear all of that, but early on, the Vietnam War was obviously a cultural shift. It's, you know, certainly different than what we're seeing today. But that, you know, required certain career choices because, you know, when I graduated, they were taking everybody. And, you know, I don't want to express my political beliefs here, but I wasn't really cut out to be in the military. So I had to look for positions that gave me a draft deferment. And so I worked for a company in Madison, Ohio that made steel mill equipment. You know, and I probably wouldn't have taken that job otherwise. I couldn't have started my own company, for example, because, you know, I had that draft concern. So I worked for that company for a while. There are no girls in Madison, Ohio, so I decided that wasn't for me. So then this position opened up at Case, which had a teaching component. So I had a teaching deferment for a while. So anyways, that caused me to do certain things, which, you know, probably worked out very well. So that was, you know, one example. I don't know what's going to happen now. I think it's just such a tragedy in terms of small businesses, and, you know, it's just going to impact for everybody, income inequality. It's tough. I've already, you know, falling asleep at night, I often think about what would I have done, you know, in terms of furloughs and layoffs and running projects. I should also mention that obviously when I was running my design and build business, I went through periods of recession, you know, like everybody does every 10 years or so. And I wasn't worried about it at all. In fact, in some respects, it almost helped me because I found, and it's probably true now, that if a company is busy trying to make production, all right, everything is pointed to getting the work out the door, which is probably not a bad thing. They often don't have time for new products. Since I was in the design mode, I was looking to supply new products for companies, you know, develop new things for them. So I found they actually had time, they could catch their breath and maybe, you know, upgrade their product line or go into new areas. So it was actually better, you know, business was actually better for me, you know, to some degree. When the economy slowed down. Plus, it was easy to hire people because people lost their jobs. You know, it probably tended to be a little bit deflationary too. Costs dropped a little bit. So I wasn't worried about, you know, recessions that much. It really didn't have too much impact on me. Of course, nowadays, again, when you have these huge organizations that are selling, you know, consumer products or software or something all over the world, then you do react to a recession. You know, my customers were a very small sample, so that wasn't, you know, wasn't a big deal. So.
Thank you, Larry. So it seems like Robert Smith has a question in the chat. Robert, do you want to ask it directly? Feel free to unmute yourself.
So, Larry, I'm old enough to remember the meter reader coming to the house, and I heard you're the one who made him obsolete. And I'm wondering where that idea came from, because I think it really disrupted an entire industry.
And my wife still gets mad at me for putting meter readers out of a job. She still thinks there's something evil about that, but that's beside the point. Doug, do you want to put on that slide again, the next slide?
Yes, let me bring that up for you.
Yeah, so as I said, to continue the story, I was doing the design and build, but I felt that it just wasn't sustainable for some of the reasons I mentioned. Maybe I wasn't good at it enough, I don't know. But I felt that a proprietary product, something that had my name on it, something where I could control the sales, everything from start to finish. But I think I was wise enough to give a lot of thought to what would be a good proprietary product. And I thought about things like, making power supplies, okay, test equipment type things, instrumentation, because that's a lot of what I had done for General Electric and for Case was working analog stuff. But I decided, for whatever reason, I was going to go big, and I really looked around for a need, and everybody remembers the meter reader, okay? Just like, maybe you remember the Eggman or somebody. And the meter reader would go door to door, and the meter reader would literally write down the numbers that appeared on your gas meter, water meter, electric meter. So the evolution of this project was that you had people, the vast majority of utilities had meter readers. Like the utility in Cleveland had 200 meter readers. I still remember that number. And it's a very, very difficult business. For example, I learned when we were doing justification studies, they had about 2% of their meter readers were in the hospital at any given time due to things like dog bites and falling down steps. There were problems with safety, and there was litigation. People said, somebody stole something because they were in the basement reading the meter. So there were all kinds of problems with it. So the first solution that came out was that they would take the meters that are indoors in the basements, which are really hard to read, and they would somehow remote the reading. And this was like a temporary fix. There was some display or object or something or gadget on the side of the house. But the first real sort of modern approach was in the early 80s, where the meter had a little radio transmitter on it, similar to something in your garage door opener, a very short-range transmitter. And a truck would drive around and energize these little gadgets, and they would send back the meter reading. And believe it or not, this system 34 years later is still out there. This is still considered to be sort of an advanced approach. But what I felt what the world really needed was a true fixed network system. So to get the reading, you didn't have to go to the house at all, or the building or the meter. You just sat back. The utility would just sit there in their office and get back the meter readings. This is a very, very challenging project because of all kinds of things. First of all, you have to get the signal back sometimes 50 miles. Okay, that's not easy. For justification, you have to have the battery last for 20 years. Okay, that's not so easy. Okay, you're having something that transmits many miles, and yet it's going to be in a sub-basement in New York City and have to transmit miles to the nearest receiving device. But I figured, hey, I had nothing else to lose, so I thought that was the approach I was going to take. Rather than making a Me Too product like a little better drive-by meter reading system or a little better remote meter reading system, I figured I'd go for the ultimate. And so the way this thing worked is that you would have MTUs, meter transmission units, somehow attached to each utility meter, and they would transmit on some schedule or randomly, whatever was decided, and they would broadcast in all different directions the meter reading information, and it would be picked up by what we call data collectors. And these would usually sit on a pole, but most likely on the roof of a building. Typically, schools worked out well because we would put these things on about a 1 square mile grid. If you look at radio probability and propagation, that means that these things have to transmit line of sight about 50 to 100 miles. All right. If they can transmit that far line of sight, that's pretty amazing. Then in Manhattan or Boston or someplace, they'll transmit a mile or two in a dense urban area. So we had to make this thing with this little tiny battery and have that kind of performance. A radio like this in those days was a couple $100 because it had to meet in very, very stiff FCC regulations for the technology for modulation and bandwidth and things like that. Obviously difficult to do. So we were trying to make something for $10 that was the equivalent of a radio in a police car, a taxi cab, maybe not quite as powerful. That would cost a couple $100. So it was a challenge. This was the basic product. This was a little box that, as I said, was, obviously waterproof and all that. That would go in a pit or go on the side of a house. And then we would have this gadget on top of a school, solar powered, and it would pick up all these random transmission that, maybe 10,000 of these would be in the range of one of these. And so this thing would sit there and accumulate the reading information. It would get an account number and the usage information. And then it would send it back to the utility. Our competitors decided to design a network of a proprietary communications network. We used cell phones. So we would get, in those days, they were called bag phones. That you'd go in your car, we'd cut off the handset, and this thing would send the information back, in basically analog, as we just send it an audio signal, essentially a keyed signal, back to the utility. This thing would call the utility and send the information back. So it was really, primitive now, but for its day, it was really, really pretty advanced. So we were very excited about this, and nobody bought it. As simple as that. There was not a lot of competition. Motorola and Schlumberger, obviously two very large companies, formed a joint venture just about the time we started to do this. And this was called MAPS, M-A-P-S, and it was funded by $40 million co-investment between those two companies. And the interesting thing happened in 1996, the FCC changed the rules. The regulations I mentioned, the technical requirements got much more difficult to meet. And so Motorola dropped out of the business. They abandoned that joint venture. So we were just about the only ones trying to do this. And we'd go all the trade shows, this and that, and it fell flat. Nobody bought it. We came out with it in the late 1990s, and nothing happened. Again, then you're back to really having money problems, because clearly we put a lot of money into this. The basic problem was, to this day, I wonder, but I really think the problem was nobody thought it would work. It was as simple as that. If you're the first one out there, and it's a technical product, and people understand what it's supposed to do, which is certainly not the case nowadays for some products you see out there, they look at it very, very carefully. Nobody would make a 20-year investment spending millions of dollars on a no-name company that supposedly had a product. And so it was tough. There were some very, very lean times here. But again, we really couldn't persuade any venture capitalists to really come forward. So it was pretty tough. I won't go into all the details, but eventually it started to go. A couple of utilities bought it. Then there would be papers presented at trade shows, and people would start to see that it was going to happen. And then the last thing that happened was that, or the last big thing was that about 2005, Pacific Gas and Electric came out for a request for a full-scale implementation on, I think it was about 5 million meters. So that means there'd be 5 million of these little gray boxes. Clearly, that was, let's just say, exciting, okay? Because, this would have increased our sales by a factor of 10. And that's when I retired, because we had there was a relationship sort of with another company. They were doing the electric meters out in California. We were doing the gas meters, and so that's the company that I ultimately sold to, and that made a lot of sense because to expand a company by a factor of 10 in a few months while working on while getting production out itself would have been a challenge. Yeah, that's certainly the case. So over time, it did go. There's about 15 million of these things out there now. These are just a couple of pictures I had in New York City. Washington, D.C., these things are underground. They're under plastic pit lids. It's hard to say. That's a loading dock of the Empire State Building. I had to take a picture of that. So that is really how it happened. That is pretty much the story.
Thank you so much, Robert, for your question. Next in Foley's, I don't know how to pronounce it. I hope I'm saying it moderately right. You seem to have had a question.
It's close enough. Thank you. I hope you can hear me, Larry.
Yes.
So my question for you was, if you don't mind telling us, who did you use as patent counsel? And if not, it's not important, but could you tell us a little bit about what it was like starting working with patent counsel? Do you have any tips for people starting out working with patent counsel? And on a personal note, I used to work for a company called, during summers, called PPM, Parts Per Million.
Oh, I remember them. I knew that company very well. I'll tell you the story about that company. There might be a lesson here. That was run by a case engineer who was probably, yes, I don't know, 10, 15 years older than me. And he was right. He was right. I played softball with his son, so I knew him. We were on the same team. And so I met him, and then eventually we ended up right next door. And so, of course, I'd be there till, midnight every night. And I would, walk to my car, and I would stop in and see him, and he'd be there running a drill press. And this guy was really, really smart. He was a terrific engineer and had a real good pedigree. And he was running the drill press. And I was talking to him once, and he was telling me about how it was a good idea, he thought, to run the drill press, because he said, why should I pay anybody, $7 an hour when I can just come here and run the drill press myself? And there is a little bit of wisdom behind that, but really it was very, very short-sighted. This guy was really good. He could have done marketing. I mean, he was basically a one-man shop, and he could have done marketing. He could have developed new products. It was not really a good investment of his time to be running a drill press. He should have been paying $7 an hour, because that's all he valued his own time at. If I was there at midnight, I was usually trying to fix something that, that was broken and had to be fixed, or some problem. I generally didn't run a drill press. So I think there's a little bit of story there. The guy was really good. He had, some good ideas, but he never quite, literally got out of the basement. And some of it, I think, was that mindset. He probably enjoyed running the drill press more than he liked, marketing, which I could certainly understand. But so that's how I knew. And I'm sorry, what was the rest of your question?
The question was, do you have any tips or hints about how someone starting out should work with a patent attorney?
Well, actually, I do have a comment there. My patent attorney was an electrical engineer from Case before he became a patent attorney. Okay, he went to Case. Actually, he went to Case for a few extra years before he got his degree. So obviously, he wasn't going to be the world's greatest engineer, but he went into law, got his became a patent attorney. And I've done a number of patents, and one thing I found is that you really have to find a patent attorney who knows the field. They say these people are, sort of secular, that a chemical engineer can understand the patent rules. I don't think that's the case. I really don't. I really liked working with this guy because, he knew technology. Curiously, the insurance agent we used was also a Case electrical engineer, graduated a couple years ahead of me. He somehow ended up in the insurance business, and we had some very complicated, contracts and deals that required bonding. If you sell a system to a utility that's going to cost them, they're going to pay you $1 million, you have to have a bonding for something like $1 million. I don't know how we ever got that, but we had a really good insurance agent who understood. I think he might have been a ham radio operator too, if I'm not mistaken. So he understood the technology. So don't let the patent attorney sell you a bill of goods. I really recommend finding somebody who knows what it is you're talking about. It's very, very important. Another thing to remember is patents are probably 99% of them are probably useless, but the bank likes them because it's an asset, okay? And having assets is great because you borrow on assets, all right? And you get investors related to your assets. So if you can patent something, the investors really don't necessarily do all that much due diligence. Perhaps they should. The banks don't do any because they don't know what you're talking about. But it's very good to have that portfolio, at least on some of your key products. In fact, that's probably something I want to talk about is this whole concept of sort of protection, you know, and trying to set up barriers, trying to have a moat to hold off competitors. And the best example is a patent. Before they changed the rules, you'd always put a patent pending sticker on whatever it is you were doing, whether or not you were applying for a patent, because that was an effort to try to, you know, dissuade some people from competing with you. You know, and it sort of became a joke, which is why they changed the law. But I always tell people that, you know, don't design a product that a ninth grader could design, you know, because it's too attractive to competitors. That's why I always like products that have a hardware component rather than a pure software play, because software, you know, a lot of times is pretty easy compared to, you know, apps, for example, compared to hardware where you've got to worry about safety and FCC and packaging and shipping. It's much more complicated to do a hardware project than a software project, or a project that is, you know, software only. So that's why I like to tell engineers that if you learn, you know, firmware and hardware, or software, firmware, and hardware, you're going to be much more valuable than someone who just knows one of those things. So, you know, that I think would be one suggestion I would have if you're trying to decide where to go with something. Make it as difficult as possible for someone to copy it. That could be with patents, that could be with trade secrets. A lot of times people protect themselves just because their product takes so much money to launch. Not many people can raise that much money. That's probably the classic way of protecting your product. It's not particularly noble, but it's one way to do it.
Thank you so much, Larry, for your answer, and thank you so much for the question. Next, I'm sorry. Can Mr. Schwuzinger,
I'm sorry?
I believe.
Yeah, Todd.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yep.
Hello,
That's,
Todd.
hey, Larry, how you doing?
Okay.
Thanks so much for doing this. Appreciate it. This is great. It's always inspirational to see stories like yours. You know, part of the story was some perseverance, right? It sounds like there were some challenges up front. Any advice for, you know, new first-time entrepreneurs or folks that are maybe battling some of those same battles today on what kept you going and sort of?
Yeah, I suggest marriage into wealth would probably be, if I had to do it again, I would probably. No, but actually, I was very fortunate because my wife was working, and, you know, when I stopped teaching at Case, you know, she carried the load for a while, and, you know, partnerships like that can really be valuable. You still have to pay the rent. So that worked out very well. In fact, when I was teaching at Case, she got her library degree, and because then it was free. So it was a nice trade-off that we had going there, and that worked out fine. Yeah, people often ask when is the best time to start a company, and I think that's interesting from a personal, you know, looking at yourself personally, because when you're young, you've got the stamina, you may have the opportunity, but of course you don't have any experience, you may not have the knowledge, you may not have the money. And then when you're middle-aged, you know, you have experience, you have knowledge, but you don't maybe have the stamina, and you've got, you know, 4 kids, and so there's never a good time, I guess, is what I would say. So I don't have any answers to that. It's just got to give it a try whenever. I would also say in that little bit in that area, I really see, and of course I see a lot of you know, companies and ideas coming through at Case. The thing that worries me is I find people who are putting the concept of being an entrepreneur before the concept of the product. I mean, there are literally people, you say, what do you want to do? And they say, well, I want to be an entrepreneur. And I always scratch my head at that, because don't you want to say, I want to make this or I want to make that, and then I'll become an entrepreneur? In other words, the whole concept of being in business and starting a company is great, but you've got to start with the idea. And even more important than the idea, you have to start with the need. I mean, to see these meter readers, go down the street in the rain carrying literally paper and pencil that is soaked with water, I mean, to me, that really pointed out a need. That was a no-brainer. It's a little more complicated today, I think, because the whole world is more complicated. But you really have to start with the need. I think just too many people stretch that, and they inadvertently sort of, instead of perceiving a need, they sort of invent the need. And certainly that works sometimes, but it's much better to hit the ground with something that the world needs rather than trying to, develop a market out of sort of nothing. A concept that's sort of vague, you're not sure if people need it. Look for something that the world really wants. I would think that's a very, very strong message that I would have.
Thank you so much, Todd. Larry, I have a question here from Anna. You spoke previously about how the global context affected, your entrepreneurship, and I wanted to know if you could share your perspective on a better pathway for current graduates and entrepreneurs looking for a position now.
Boy, that is tough because in the last couple of months, just everything changed. I've seen some figures on how so many people live near the edge. The average, I don't know if it's the average restaurant, I think, can survive about 27 days with no income. I mean, that's just frightening. And I think I would always recommend that you better have a plan B and a plan C in case things don't work out the way you would hope. Okay, you've got to have resilience. You've got to have sort of financial stamina. The paycheck, payments get lost, employees get sick. I mean, there's just so many things out there that can happen on a good day, that, I certainly, obviously was lucky, and I think luck had a lot to do with it. The order comes in, at the right time. The guy who did the books, he would spend a lot of his time just driving around to vendors and, pleading for more time, keep your credit rating up, be honest and fair and, transparent. And, usually you'll get some time, you get some understanding. The biggest subcontracting, the biggest design and build company we had ended up, this company still makes most of the car wash controls in the country. And, we basically carried this guy for years, developing his products and working with him. And, he was like the greatest customer you could ever have, because we were, he owed us something, and in turn, we had a great customer that we worked very, very hard for. So I think this type of relationship can be very, very helpful. You're not going to see that now if you're selling software to, the whole world or something, or if you're selling, stuff out of your garage on eBay, you don't have these relationships to build. But certainly if you're in a B2B situation, these relationships, are very, very important. You try to make them as personal as you can. So if things go south for a while, you have a relationship that you can use to deal with it. I think that's really important. Not everything can be remote and virtual and sort of faceless. That's not going to happen. I think what I remember most about that business is the companies we worked with very, very closely and had these relationships. That was very important.
Thank you, Larry. I think relationship is very important to keep in entrepreneurship, and that's definitely a relevant lesson for people to take. We have a question here from Rick Pagel. Mm-hmm. Unmuting yourself and asking your question.
Rick, did you want to ask a question? Okay,
yes.
Great. Go ahead.
I know later on when you sold your company to the other company, they did gas and electric meter reading. I wondered why you didn't think about electric or do electric meter reading initially when you were doing the gas meters.
Yeah, it's a very good question because it seems obvious. In some respects, an electric meter is a far easier product to design and build. It wouldn't seem obvious, but it is because you have power, all the power you want. So a whole aspect of the design, which is, it's called micropower electronics, is not there. You don't have anything to worry about. During a power failure, you have to, limp along for a while. But other than that, because of that, it's sort of, overall a somewhat simpler product. For example, you can transmit much farther, much more easily because you could, use as much power as you want. But the bigger problem was, this is entirely sort of circumstantial in a way, is that the electric meter product had to fit under the glass, okay, because that's where they belonged, okay? They had to be round and fit under the globe of the electric meter. For that reason, you had to partner with an electric meter company, and that was difficult to do because there are only a few of them, like 4 or 5 of them, and they were struggling to develop their own products. Their products were different, they worked different ways, but we couldn't find a good partner to work with. We had some relationships that lasted for a while, but it just didn't work. It had to be integrated into the meter very, very carefully. As a matter of fact, when my company was sold, I sold it to a company that totally messed it up. They in turn sold it to somebody else. Now it's doing very well. About the first thing that company did after they bought my company was go out and buy an electric meter company. They bought the division, the 150 whatever year old division, 130-year-old division of General Electric that made electric meters. And that was a terrific plus for for my old company, because now they could partner with an electric company, and now they could do gas, water, and electric. So the electric meter circuit board had to fit in the meter. Our product was for gas and electric, so in some respects it was much more challenging because it had to run on a battery, but we didn't have to partner with anyone because it was just a little box with wires coming out that basically attached to the water meter or the gas meter. So it was a circumstance that was just sort of tied into the mechanical aspects of the programs. But it's a very good question because we would have loved to have an electric meter product.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Brian. Brian, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly?
Yeah, thanks very much. Larry, thanks so much for this webinar. I really appreciate it. I had a question. When you were trying to sell the hexagram solution, did you run into any folks from, the tin hat crowd that were worried about the EMF radiation from radio devices?
Oh, it's probably the same people who are drinking bleach right now. There's always somebody out there. There are actually FCC restrictions on radiated power. And because this thing transmits only for really a matter of, say, under 100 milliseconds, a few times a day, the average power is, like 3 or 4 decimal places, to the right as a percentage of the FCC limits. So to answer your question, it was very easy to verify that it wasn't going to cause a problem, but that doesn't mean that, people are out there saying that it, reprogrammed their pacemaker, or they heard the signal in their teeth or something. So, but, frankly, that wasn't our problem. I mean, if, 24 people refused to have it and filed the lawsuit, that was the utilities problem and not ours. But we had to back it up, by getting these tests done and have that information available. But yeah, it happened. You still hear about it. So.
Thank you, Brian, for your question. So we're about to wrap up, but Larry, I had just one last question. We've already touched upon the current pandemic and the current global situation. But I wanted to know from you if you have any kind of final remarks or pieces of advice for students or any entrepreneurs now that are trying to, continue on with the entrepreneurship within the global context.
I think you're going to find a reconsideration of how to do business because of the pressures that companies are seeing now. In other words, an entrepreneur that had an idea and was going to, fly out to the West Coast and was going to raise, $10 million off the bat, they're probably rethinking that. And maybe the various investors are rethinking that too. And the people doing this are probably going to learn to do it better, okay? Because they're not going to find the financing to coming as easily as they had hoped, all right? Now, of course, the number of people, you only read about the people that raise all this money. You never read about the people that don't. But, in general, I think that entrepreneurs, especially, sort of young ones, spend an unfortunate amount of time chasing money, okay? And I don't mean to discourage any of these really neat, competitions and challenges and, other opportunities for prize money that frankly, that ThinkBox makes available. I don't mean to put those down, but get your product to work, all right? That is a higher priority than trying to raise, funny money. That you're still, your prime goal in life is to end up with something that works and something that people that want to buy. All right. The concept about ThinkBox as a resource for entrepreneurs is that you can realize these ideas without a big investment. Okay. I mean, my first oscilloscope in today's dollars was like $8,000. I have no idea where I got that. I mean, that was how much money I made in a year. My first milling machine was probably $15,000 or $18,000. I don't know where that money came from. Probably came from not buying a house as early as I should have. But at ThinkBox, if you show up there, and of course it's open to anybody, we have that kind of equipment, that kind of expertise, that kind of material. The idea was ThinkBox in general doesn't take an ownership position in any kind of new venture, but what we can do is hopefully make it a little bit easier for you. Okay, we can provide the machinery, we can provide the equipment. You don't have to go outside if you're looking for a $20,000 3D printer or something. So that was the original thought. It's an investment in kind. And we hope to make it easy for people, certainly a lot easier than, maybe I found back in the day. So maybe people don't have to work so hard to scare up these investments. They're not going to find them as easily, perhaps, as they would have anyways, and they could maybe better concentrate on their product, their idea, getting some, IP protection on it and, really take care of business and not worry too much about, chasing the golden egg for a while. I don't know if that'll happen, but even in good times, I really recommend think twice before you spend, a lot of effort on your, trying to raise funds. You always joke, that, I'm not sure, that Bill Gates ever wrote a business plan. It just, concentrated on getting the work out. So that's a suggestion I have. You only have limited time, you only have limited resources, and I really think that, if you can verify this product, you can realize it in something tangible, you can have a model, a prototype, you can test it. I think that's pretty valuable, and that goes for software and hardware too, of course. I think that should come first before you, start to, go out there and shake the trees.
Thank you so much for your answer, Larry. And as a student worker, I completely second your statement on ThinkBox as a resource and, help that it gives to student entrepreneurs here at CASE. I'll pass back to you, Michael. Thank you so much for giving me this space, and thank you, Larry.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks, Masato, for moderating. It's so great. You're wearing your, as you add to your tool belt at ThinkBox, all the student workers, one of the cool things is when you're on the the third floor, you can sort of see what badges that all the students have to all the machinery they can use. We should have a new one that has student moderator of our speaker series.
Be good.
You get a gold star. So thanks for doing this. Larry, thank you. It's so fun. Your engagement with students and faculty and staff on campus is really unparalleled. You're always around ThinkBox. You really roll your sleeves up with students, with all of us, to think about ways that we can make more of an impact. And it's such a pleasure to work with you. And for those that have not been to ThinkBox, because I know we have people from all over the country that are here, but when you're back in Cleveland and back on campus, please come see us. We do have some folks from LaunchNet, which is our partner. Bob Sopko's on the call. That's one of the partners at ThinkBox that really helps folks kind of with an idea sort of start putting the paces on where there might be a business around it. We do have some more speakers this week. I know for some of you that I was talking to you before, this is the first time that you joined one of our speaker series, but I wanted to just briefly mention some of the other events that we have coming up this week. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock Eastern, we have Robert Musselwhite, who's the CEO within the United Healthcare Group called Optum Insight. So he'll be speaking about what Optum's doing. Actually, Robert also recently recovered from COVID-19, so he's working with hospitals and policymakers around the coronavirus, and he recently is recovering from it, so he has some interesting perspectives. So that'll be at 1 o'clock. Tomorrow on Wednesday at 1 o'clock, one of our great alums, Ashi Bachu, who's a founder and CEO of MC Squared Health out in San Francisco, is going to join us. Also another healthcare related talk. And then on Friday, we'll have the final panel of the Beyond Silicon Valley massive open online course that we've relaunched to focus on supporting entrepreneurship in the global crisis. And that's going to be on the topic of access to capital. So Larry's kicking off 4 events we have this week. And again, you're welcome to join via Zoom or Facebook Live, and we do record all of these sessions later for folks that are interested. So once again, everybody, thank you for joining. Larry, thank you for your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you all soon at a future event. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, thank you all.